He wrote the longest symphony ever. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Dimitrie Cuclin. Cuclin was born in eastern Romania, in the town of Galați, in April of 1885. His father was a musically trained immigrant from the part of the Russian Empire that's now the Ukraine, while his mother was from Romania. Young Dimitrie first learned music from his father, who had himself learned music in some of Romania's largest cities. His mother-in-law sent one of his string quartets to a member of the composition faculty at the Bucharest Conservatory, who encouraged him to apply. When he was 19, he began studying at Bucharest's Royal Academy of Music. He was turned down from the conservatory because of his age, for some reason. Many details of his life remain sparse. Cuclin wanted to study in Paris, but he was unable to get into the conservatoire there because they required him to audition on an instrument, and he just wasn't good enough on the violin to get in. But like Bucharest, Paris had two schools of music, and they offered their students different things. Thus, Cuclin ended up studying at the Scala Cantorum, which was more conservative and rigorous in its training of the basics. At this point, it was still led by its founder, the stalwart Vincent Dandy. Cuclin got there on scholarship and was able to study there for 3 years, but despite his best efforts, the scholarship was not renewed. The money ran out, and he hadn't graduated yet. He was forced to leave Paris without a degree, but Dandy wrote him a glowing recommendation letter. He got back to Romania just in time for World War I to engulf the continent. He never saw action, he just played the violin in orchestras and generally wrote it out. At the conclusion of hostilities, he became a professor at the very institution which had turned him down years before, and he would teach there until 1948, save for an 8-year stint where he taught in New York. By this time, World War II had come and gone, and Cuclin found himself living in the Socialist Republic of Romania. And if you're familiar with how composers generally fare under communist regimes, you'll know that he was artistically repressed. He committed sort of a double whammy, in that the regime didn't like his music, and they also didn't like the people he hung out with. And so they blasted him as right-wing, and they sentenced him to 2 years as a political prisoner, as one of thousands building the Danube-Black Sea Canal. At this point, Cuclin was in his mid-60s. While he was still alive at the end of his 2-year sentence, which was more than many people could say in his position, the experience, understandably, took a toll on him. He was never fully rehabilitated in the eyes of the communist government, and he first began to notice the symptoms of heart disease. This would eventually kill him in February 1978, him having made it to the ripe old age of 92. In a final slap to his face, he was only ever given honors by the Union of Composers after he died. By the end, he had felt cut off from the musical world. His music was still too avant-garde for the authorities, but he was still positioning himself as anti-Western and anti-serialist. So he just wasn't enough anti-Western and enough anti-serialist in the same way that the communist regime wanted. He was stuck. He had no real allies. Cuclin's music was very in line with the French, so it's understandable that the communists would see his music as Western. His output is dominated by the symphony. He'd written a few throughout his career, but it was during his time as a political prisoner that he decided that he was going to commit the rest of his life to creating a symphonic body of work that was of breathtaking scope and scale. These are definitely all big works, but none of them are bigger than the 12th Symphony, which apparently lasts something around 6 hours. No one really knows, because no one's tried to play the thing. It's hard enough putting on Havergal Brian's infamous Gothic symphony, but that was more for the performing forces involved. Even the Gothic doesn't take 6 hours. Even the best efforts of Khosrow Sorabji, the king of pre-minimalist multi-hour-long music, only resulted in a symphony that's roughly 4.5 hours long. Amateur. The sad truth is that Cuclin's 12th is not the only piece to have gone without a performance or a recording. Almost all of his 20 symphonies have yet to be premiered or recorded. They all require rather large orchestras, if not full-on choral orchestral forces, which certainly doesn't help matters. It's hard enough to program a chamber symphony from someone as obscure as Cuclin, let alone big pieces like those. When looking at his symphonies as a whole, the first 14 fit into this grand narrative with spiritual subtitles and this huge overarching tonal plan. The later ones aren't part of a grander narrative, but they are heavily influenced by his philosophy, which we'll get to in a second. They were all about big, heavy subjects like the aspirations of humankind, all while weaving in Romanian folk tunes or folk-esque tunes, something he also did in his chamber music. He also wrote a set of suites for unaccompanied violin, and I don't know why these aren't better known, because, like, what's easier to put on? I mean, a huge symphony or just a violinist? I digress. Cuclin was a polymath and an avid writer. He authored plays, poems, parables, textbooks, dialogues, and metaphysical treatises. He knew at least 4 languages: Romanian, French, English, and Latin, and he translated some Latin classics into Romanian. He often found points of comparison between poetic forms and musical forms. Metaphysics was a big interest of his, but it's hard to describe in a succinct way exactly what this entails. For one thing, I don't think he ever published any of it in English, and when you're dealing with heavy subject matter, translations are very dicey. His view of metaphysics linked together all sorts of subjects, including music, which he found to be more than just sound. I'm reminded of the great Charles Ives quote, "What does sound have to do with music?" Today, Cuclin, if he's known at all, is known unfairly as a footnote, or worse yet, a punchline, a guy who wrote a 6-hour symphony purely for the sake of writing a 6-hour symphony. But nothing could be further from the truth. Cuclin's music represents an epic swath of Romaniana and an all-encompassing philosophy, and it deserves to be better known.